So is it just me, or was 2017 an absolutely insane year for game soundtracks? The amount of experimentation and just plain amazing music was really off the charts. Any of the OSTs released this year would have been shoo-ins for soundtrack of the year in any other year really. But this year for me, and many others in the VGM community, the game that was leading the pack was The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. But depending on who you talk to, this is either the obvious choice or an incredibly controversial one. I promise you that at some point or another there's going to be one comment about how awful the music was. And that's because that the Breath of the Wild soundtrack can understandably be somewhat polarizing. Really, I'm not surprised by this at all. Gone are the sweeping orchestral scores, the heavy leitmotifs, and the pieces of music that we've all grown to love over the years. Instead, they're replaced with twinkling piano, sparse instrumentation, and rhythmic ideas that can be hard for the untrained ear to follow. So yes, this is jarring. It's unlike anything we've heard in Zelda music before. So why did the music team choose this route? Bigger games mean bigger music, right? Isn't that how it works? Well, not always. I want to talk a bit today about the historical implications of the soundtrack, how we ended up where we did, and also the real-world classical music influences that allowed this soundtrack to exist in the first place. To start to understand the music in Breath of the Wild, we actually need to take a detour to Paris, France in the late 1800s, where an art movement called Impressionism got its start with a man named Claude Monet. As many of you likely know, Monet was a painter, so that means that he didn't have anything to do with music. Well, in most eras of history, such as the Renaissance, Baroque, Classical, and Romantic eras, the term art encompasses not only visual art, but also music and often many other forms of art as well. Each of these areas was underlined by some kind of new idea or mindset that permeated every aspect of artistic interpretation. So by a broad definition, the Impressionist movement sought to capture things such as feelings and experiences rather than true artistic accuracy. If you're familiar with paintings by Monet, such as this one here, you can find a good place to get a feel of what the movement stood for in regards to these feelings and experiences. You know what this image is. You can see a castle, water, sunset, and maybe some ships in the distance, but you aren't given any details. You're being conveyed the experience. Impressionism in music sought to capture these same ideas, feelings and experiences. It wasn't as much about how the music sounded based on traditional music theory, or how fast you could play, or the size of your ensemble, but rather the emotions and ideas that the music evoked in the listener. Personally, when I describe Impressionist music, I describe it as trying to paint pictures with music. Say that you want to paint a picture of a rising sun. What would it look like? Well, to be blunt, it would just look like a sunrise. But now say that you were to write a piece of music that was to describe this painting of a rising sun. How would that sound? If you watched my video on Animal Crossing that I put out before, that question is going to sound pretty familiar to the questions that I asked there. These are the ideas that were first introduced and answered in Impressionism, and they used new colors and music to achieve that. Now, I know that you're here to listen to me talk about Zelda, but before we start applying this towards Breath of the Wild, we need to get a brief history of how we ended up at Impressionist music. Trust me, this does help for full context. So you can view the start of Impressionist music in the early 1900s from a few different perspectives. The first one is that many people subscribe to the idea that Impressionism is simply an extension of the Romantic era. This era consisted of composers such as Beethoven, Chopin, Mahler, and Wagner, and that the Impressionists wanted less structure and fewer rules, or simply for their music to feel more organic. The second way that it could be viewed would be as bridging a gap that was beginning to appear between the Romantics and the Modernists and the Expressionist music that followed Impressionism. And finally, others do consider it flat out the early stages of the Modernist movement, as Impressionists were trying to break free of the shackles presented by their ancestors, and then Modernism fully leaned towards this direction. However, we're going to save Modernism for a different day. Regardless of how you personally view it, there's really only a few truly Impressionist composers from this period. The main ones that we think of today are Claude Debussy and Maurice Ravel. Some people will probably say that Erik Satie is also, but personally I think it's more accurate to just solidify him in the Dadaist movement instead. Most of the Impressionist movement, however, can primarily be attributed to Claude Debussy, and so in regards to Breath of the Wild music, he's going to be the person that we're focusing on. For some context on Debussy's music, I've actually been playing one of his pieces, titled The Sunken Cathedral, in the background for a while now. Feel free to check out this piece and listen for any similarities that you might hear in Breath of the Wild, because there are some. So after all this historical context about Impressionism and describing experiences, you might be thinking, wait, but isn't video game music meant to accompany the gameplay, to drive the experience home? What's this about describing music, scenery, and using colors for the music in games? Doesn't that sound like it wouldn't fit game music? Well, really, you're right. In traditional game music theory, Impressionism shouldn't work for video games, but in Breath of the Wild it does. I'm going to challenge you to think of the separation of Impressionism versus video game music as Impressionism describing player experience, or what you're doing, and, quote, normal game music as heightening the player experience, pulling you further into the context of the rest of the game. And this distinction right here is exactly where the Breath of the Wild soundtrack becomes polarizing. Zelda has a very long history of heightening the emotions of players through music. There's even an orchestral concert series that's meant to serve this exact purpose. There's incredible melodies, sweeping orchestral scores, and a ton of story context that goes along with the music. The series has some of the best overall game music ever written, and many people definitely agree on that. The reason for this boils down to three main reasons: memorable themes, emotional connection to gameplay, and simply having good music. But Breath of the Wild takes this and throws it all away. Well, not all of it, but most of it. It gets rid of a lot of the themes and puts in a ton of silence instead, and it's considered by many people to not be good music. Why? Why would they do this? Because Impressionism is painting pictures through music, describing the experience, and through describing does it tell you about the world. Breath of the Wild as a whole reworked everything about the Zelda formula. You get all of your important items immediately, and you can instantly go anywhere, anytime once you're off the Great Plateau. You have an absolutely enormous landscape to explore, and often there's no music to accompany that. No ocarina, maybe a few town themes or a few other themes, but often it's just atmospheric music that doesn't always make sense, or maybe even just the sound effects and the ambience of the outside. You can see a mountain in the distance, and instead of thinking it's background info, you can say, oh, I want to go there. So you can, and you make this long, mostly silent trek devoid of music. And once you climb that mountain, you find yourself surrounded by snow. And while you're traversing this tundra, you're listening to this soft, ambient music that doesn't quite make sense in the background. But when did that music get there? There's no singable melody, but it's not purely ambient music. It's not music that accompanies you climbing the mountain. It's not a character theme, and it's not even background music like you'd hear on Death Mountain. It's just music. It's just music. If that mountain that you're on right now had naturally occurring music that came from nature and wasn't written by someone, how would that sound? Well, it would sound like the music of a mountain. Impressionism describes, game music heightens. It would be music that describes the mountain that you're on. It's music that's painting a picture of your surroundings, but it isn't necessarily involved in the world. It's just there. Impressionism describes, themes heighten. This was the exact experience that I had when the Breath of the Wild soundtrack fully clicked for me. And it's music that really, to me, entirely describes the core of the experience of the game. On a mountain, what would you hear in nature? Wind, footsteps, animals. Sounds can have musical quality, but they aren't always music. This game takes that and answers the question, what would the naturally occurring music on this mountain be? Most of the soundtrack is structured around these ideas. Now, if you watch my video on Animal Crossing, you're probably saying, yeah, but Kyle, this is exactly what you said Manaka Katauka did with her hourly themes in New Leaf. Asking what hours sound like. Now you're telling me to ask what mountains and landscapes sound like? Well, the primary composer on Breath of the Wild is Manaka Katauka, not Koji Kondo. And to me, this is honestly my favorite fact about game music. She's a composer that asks such pointed questions and gets to the bottom of these questions in such unique ways. And the fact that she nails this in such drastically different games is impressive beyond belief. However, it's not like they did away with all of the old Zelda music. They just ran it through an Impressionism machine. The best example of this is actually with the Song of Time, which I'll start playing here in a second. In Impressionism, you'll actually hear that a lot of the harmonies and melodies are very unique in comparison to what we're used to. But instead of major and minor scales, we're often given things such as whole tone scales, which is a scale built entirely out of whole steps. It kind of sounds like this. So as you can see, this scale really has no resolution. You can definitely hear these implications on melody and harmony in the Song of Time right here. You'll likely notice that most of this melody that we're familiar with already has been reharmonized with very impressionistic sounds, almost to the point of where it might be unrecognizable. The number of people that I've actually encountered who didn't even realize that this is the Song of Time is really astounding. The tempo isn't too strict, it's very free, seemingly at the pure discretion of the performer. This track is so strongly impressionistic, and it's right at the beginning of the game. It's my personal thought that this choice was intentional, as it's a track that so many people are already familiar with. Composers, take note. Hearing music that we're already familiar with, but hearing it so differently right away at the beginning of the game, can be a great way to get the player acquainted with the rest of the soundtrack if it's different. This, to me, acts as sort of a way to get the player's feet wet in Impressionism before they actually set off on their journey in Zelda. That is, only if they so choose to hear the track at the beginning, of course. Now, another thing that's always brought up is that another reason for this impressionistic shift is that the world is so sprawling that having large, thick, mind-occupying music at all times wouldn't make sense for gameplay. It would quickly become overwhelming, and it would take away from the experience that the player actually has. It would focus more on the heightening of experience that I talked about, when really, in this case of the game, heightening the experience isn't the needed musical effect. Honestly, having large orchestras or themes at all times in the overworld would even get annoying to the player. One thing that I actually read once had a person saying that they would rather hear the Hyrule Field theme from Twilight Princess playing on loop instead of the field music and silence that's in Breath of the Wild. So you can test this yourself actually. Find an hour-long loop of the Twilight Princess Hyrule Field theme and play Breath of the Wild for an entire hour until the track finishes while listening to it. Let me know how that goes. The Impressionist soundscape directly mirrors the physical one in front of you in the game. It's vast, sparse, and decorated with beauty. It describes your experience. Despite the difficulties of Impressionism in game music, I do think that there is a huge and still mostly untapped place for it in the world of game music. Obviously, you shouldn't force one genre into soundtracks just to do it, but in games that do feature heavy exploration or a focus on the unknown, Impressionism can be an excellent tool that can be used to provide a bit more wonder and uncertainty to the world. We just have to be smart about it. Breath of the Wild really does have one of my favorite soundtracks of all time. This information obviously isn't going to make the soundtrack better for many people, but I'm just hoping that it will provide some context and some historical perspective on why the music is the way it is. If there's one thing to take away from all of this, music evolves over time, and that's okay. Game music is no different. It should evolve too. This is just evolving in a way that many people don't have the context for. So be open to new styles of music in games. And finally, always approach music with an open mind. Thank you so much, everybody. And until next time. Hey there, thanks so much for joining me today. Hopefully this video helped provide a little bit of context about where the music came from in Breath of the Wild. If you haven't seen it, you can check out my other video that I did on Animal Crossing music right over here. And any likes, comments, or subscribes are super appreciated, and I definitely hear them. Please feel free to get in touch with me on Twitter @KyLidian, or feel free to join a Discord server of game composers called Beats to Play Games 2. I'm going to leave the link for that right in the description below. I'm planning on doing several other videos. I've got one planned for Persona 5, Hollow Knight, Nier, but if you have any ideas on what you'd like to see or any other suggestions for the channel, please feel free to let me know in the comments. And if you are just getting started in game music or are thinking that you might want to write game music, I am running a series as well on getting started in the industry. So feel free to check that out. I'm talking about a lot of things that I wish that I knew when I was starting out myself, so hopefully they can help you too. I really do appreciate you stopping by today. Thanks so much, everybody.